Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski, and today we're going to be getting into more literary analysis. And specifically, I was thinking about calling this something like Nietzsche's most scathing critiques of Christianity, or perhaps Nietzsche's war against Christianity, or any number of kind of conceptual frameworks as that, because what it is specifically is a lot of his much more specific and in-depth critique from his notes, which were collected and published under the name Will to Power. And there's a whole argument and debate amongst scholars of including or not including, how much did his sister or other people alter the content. But if you know Nietzsche's entire body of works, and if you've read it, then you can see by the time you look at something like Will to Power that it's entirely consistent in some places. In some places it has stuff that's nowhere else in his work, and sometimes it's his work condensed down, or it's his ideas laid bare minus the philosophical stylings. And as with a lot of his philosophy, you can read it kind of straightforward, but it's also enjoyable if there's a little bit of an attitude to it, or a little bit of a certain incredulity, right? Of the astonishment at what you're discovering here. It's very charming, right? Because aside being probably one of the smartest men, if not the smartest man to ever live in human history, he also seems to be about the funniest man in human history. Even though, those who can't get past the pains of his criticisms have a hard time swallowing that. That becomes their problem. He was just, he was just the man who saw what he saw. So there was no averting his eyes from that, and he wasn't going to back down. So back to his whole premise was men of the future, because remember, he lived a long time ago, that men of the future, their strength would be measured by the amount of truth they could take in a world where people increasingly just cannot stand the reality of reality, or the thought of reality, right? Everything is about escape, repression, seeking that idealistic better world, right? We're building it. The revolution won't be televised, but Krusty's going to be here tomorrow. Take your dollars, pray for heaven. Your reward comes in the afterlife. Your reward is some other time and place, but in reality, as he discusses, the whole point of a state, the whole point of government and culture is law and barrier to individual. It's not about helping the individual, and that all about Christianity stood against culture and the strength therein. But I'm going to go ahead and start reading. This was section 54 from Will to Power. Real quick, I didn't take the header titles and the exact numbering, but I just have the kind of aphorism numbers, and then, some notes about what it kind of means. So I'm starting with 54 here. After thousands of years of error and confusion, it is my good fortune to have rediscovered the road which leads to a yea and to a nay. I teach people to say nay in the face of all that makes for weakness and exhaustion. I teach people to say yeah in the face of all that makes for strength, that preserves strength, and justifies the feeling of strength. Up to the present, neither one nor the other has been taught, but rather virtue, disinterestedness, pity, and even the negation of life. All these are values proceeding from exhausted people. After having pondered over the physiology of exhaustion for some time, I was led to the question, to what extent the judgments of exhausted people had percolated into the world of values. The result at which I arrived was as startling as it could possibly be, even for one like myself who is already at home in many a strange world. Right? Remember, he's very introverted, and he makes strong distinctions between the extroverted sensory type and the intuitive exploratory type, introverted intuitive type. I found that all prevailing values, that is to say, all those which had gained ascendancy over humanity, or at least over its tamer portions, could be traced back to the judgment of exhausted people. Under the cover of the holiest names, I found that the most destructive tendencies, people had actually given the name God, in quote marks here, to all that renders weak, teaches weakness, and infects with weakness. I found that the good man was a form of self-affirmation on part of decadence. That virtue with Schopenhauer still proclaimed as superior to all and as the most fundamental of all virtues. Even that same pity I recognized as more dangerous than any vice. Nihilism. Deliberately to thwart the law of selection among species and their natural means of purging their stock of degenerate members, this, up to my time, had been the greatest of all virtues. And I've said this elsewhere, but people are confused about what civilization is, and whatever it may or may not be, it's about hegemony, the consolidation of power. It's not about sharing power. It's about nations and peoples maintaining power so other nations don't overrun and destroy you, right? Enslave you, those kinds of things, right? So what he's pointing out is that the species began to believe that it could save everyone and everything, that the most noblest thing you could do is basically fight against reality, which is fight against time, death, everything real becomes unreal, the future disappears, right? Things get very strange with Western philosophy at these junctures. But he goes on. One should do honor to the fatality which says to the feeble, perish. The opposing of this fatality, the botching of mankind and the allowing of it to putrefy, was given the name God. One shall not take the name of the Lord one's God in vain. The race is corrupted not by its vices, but by its ignorance. It is corrupted because it has not recognized exhaustion as exhaustion. Physiological misunderstandings are the cause of all evil. Virtue is our greatest misunderstanding. Problem. How were the exhausted able to make the laws of values? In other words, how did they do what they did? How did they who are the last come to power? How did the instincts of the animal man ever get to stand on their heads? Right? And he's going to specify, right, that the very ideas of selecting and deselecting, as I sort of mentioned, right, that civilization is for the survivors and people think it's for the civilized. It's like, no, the civilized are the tame ones who generally get enslaved, killed, disappear in huge swaths through all human history because they were predated on by other people, or by their own people, right? Their own state, right? Because that's what the state does. So going on, 200, I regard Christianity as the most fatal and seductive lie that has yet existed as the greatest and most impious lie. I can discern the last sprouts and branches of its ideal beneath every form of disguise. I decline to enter into any compromise of false position in reference to it. I urge people to declare open war with it. And basically, he's talking about Platonism. He's talking about idealism. He's talking about where people hide their morality. And to Nietzsche, morality is the weaker bargaining position. It's fighting against reality and the willingness to subvert values and language and the very meaning of life and death itself to do so. So he sees it as a self-immolation. He sees it as a mistake, and hence he calls it a history of errors. So he goes on. The morality of paltry people is the measure of all things. This is the most repugnant kind of degeneracy that civilization has yet brought into existence, and this kind of ideal is hanging still under the name of God over men's heads. And this is why he mentions that, like, the state that seeks to constrain all these forces, why he calls it the new idol, why he calls it as, basically it's for the superfluous, because he says it's exactly what serves these conditions. It's exactly what's facilitated the unreality, what's worked towards it, right? So basically what he's saying is that, wherever it's hidden, the dialectics, the process, the progress, the idealism, the liberalism, or otherwise, the destructive and consumptive machinations of the state, or in modern terms, is big daddy government. You can replace people with AI now, just like we replace blue collar workers, increasingly replace the white collar workers. And you see that people seem to be increasingly just deselected for, replaced by technology as needs and environment change. So Nietzsche is very much a proponent of novelty, saying, nature seeks to create new, beautiful, strong forms. That seems to be the real selection process. And anything and anyone that stands in the way of that has it backwards, basically, right? So again, any form of idealism, Platonism, Schopenhauerianism, general escapism, Kantianism, Hegelianism, Marxism, dialectics and dialogues predicated on pandering and posturing, the utter impotence of slave morality, its protest and needs of cloaks of its weaker bargaining position. These are the kinds of things that Nietzsche is saying. When he sniffs them out, he can find it in any ideology, in any form that it manifests, because it keeps recreating itself in the world because it's so pervasive. One of the quotations of his that I wanted to find that I couldn't find, and I was pretty sure it's in Will to Power, though I couldn't find it, but I couldn't find it in Human All Too Human or the other places I thought it might be, was Nietzsche saying something like, to him, Christianity, it was astounding that a single ideology had botched the entire species of mankind, the entire planet. Now, that's not literal, right? It doesn't mean literally everyone became Christian or Christianized, even with the lingua, like the kind of de facto power of Western economy and forces that came to dominate the world and create its competition. More like what he's saying is that no matter ultimately what he's saying is no matter how it manifests, no matter where people try to play these shell games and look at the past and try to reevaluate it, yet keep interpreting the same idealism and then chasing that kind of egoistic presumption and hope across ever ironic boundaries, Nietzsche's just saying his very sensibilities and his methodology led him to find it wherever it was hidden. Hence, he did a radical about face and did a transvaluation of the existing values and where they come from through his genealogy of morality to show what was really taking place, that it was power at work, power hiding itself from its enemies, power learning from the weaker and the weaker learning from the stronger, right? All these sorts of things. So, these kind of true world theories, that which posits an alternate state that is somehow removed or different from the one real state that one finds oneself. The felt presence of immediate experience, the singular moment of which dreams and ideas of the future lead and mislead, of which one state is required a removal so one can transition to create the alternate state. Well, escapism, delusion, ultimately pure fantasy, because everything about him talking about nihilism is a certain understanding that things are ambered in time, that nobody does anything, that there are no causes and effects here that we create that aren't fictions for what was set in motion based on what we presume to be a priori understanding, meaning we can somehow suss back far enough to the causes to even be able to attribute cause and effect, which in Nietzsche's mind is nothing but fiction. It's the world as will. And will to power. So my notes go on, and this is where, when I said it's escapism and delusion, this might be a good place to examine that. Where does Nietzsche's then kind of philosophy of the spirit, the free spirit specifically fit into this, that idea of the metamorphoses of the spirit, especially for saying there's no such thing as metaphysics. There's no back world hidden. Nothing is hidden. There's no objective better tomorrow that's going to be created, right? If all these sorts of things are the case, then how could he even put something forward like camel, lion, and child? And Nietzsche removes the superordinate other. He removes the mysterious powers that are blocking or not blocking. He says there's no such thing as free will. It's determined and it's eternally recurrent, and that superordinate other is just gone. The idealism which posits duality, the morality which does brutal damage to real reason and thinking, man's prowess. Crippling a man's mind is worse than crippling his body. And lastly, this is what it means to be beyond good and evil. This was going back to Gnosticism, Zoroastrianism. If God is the source of all eternal good, then evil becomes the internal principle hand in hand. There is no mythology or story here without the devil, and all of this is sheer fantasy, that which leads to insanity. So in the sense that we kind of banished poets and free thinkers a long time ago, and then pruned and retarded the human intellect into these directions, Nietzsche is saying none of this was accidental, none of this could have happened any other way. This was just Christianity's course once it got a hold of the types of man. So in terms of his lion and child state, what he's saying with the camel is that it's on you. It's not a matter of free wills, it's just weak and strong wills. So you burn up the camel. A lot of camels die en route, right? A lot of lions die fighting. But if a child is born, well, he does this to state it's on you. It's not a matter of free will, choice, enlightenment, escape. It's burdening yourself to learn there is no escape. There's not even escape forward anymore because man encircles the planet. To battle it out with existing values, to get over yourself, both the conformity and your originality, your genius that gets in the way, to create your own values, to overcome your own limitations, be your own bridge, and the clear example of possibilities for others, that of personality, character, knowing, delivery, however you want to put it, art and style, right? So, but in all this is an instinctually driven animal, where not poisoned or damaged. I see this as wholly instinctual. And ecce homo, Nietzsche states something to the effect of, in this light, even my blunders aren't blunders. If everything is a part of one's own instincts and learning process of what we seek and seek out, right, then even the notion of mistakes or wasting time, then you see that there's no such thing as wasting time. More like there's probably those who allow themselves to be wasted. Because like Nietzsche talks about, that's just what a morbid will looks like, right? What is the alternate that posits that's not what everyone has been doing all along anyway, right? Like biding time, binding time, building power seems realer than real to me. So kind of why Zarathustra says, do as my example. I'm a prelude to better players of better games. And again, like I said with Nietzsche, he's a philosopher of types, so he notes that, formerly the sensualists, the sensory-oriented, extroverted, gregarious types, they had their domination and say for a long time, and now we've re-entered a different world state in which God and history and time become completely superfluous. So, 201, this is back to Will to Power, not my notes. However modest one's demands may be concerning intellectual cleanliness, when one touches the New Testament, one cannot help experiencing a sort of inexpressible feeling of discomfort, right? This is what I was talking about with a little bit of attitude. For the unbounded cheek with which the least qualified people will have their say in its pages, in regard to the greatest problems of existence, and claim to sit in judgment of such matters, exceeds all limits. The impudent levity with which the most unwieldy problems are spoken of here, life, the world, God, the purpose of life, as if they are not problems at all, but the most simple things which these little bigots know nothing about, right? They basically say, there's nothing to know. We already know the beginning, we know the middle, and we know the ending. Don't think. Thinking is troublesome, or worse, thinking is evil, right? Yeah, it's the most backwards, anti-instinctual, anti-intellect, anti-humanity sentiment in the world. You see that a large portion of the species, what they're reacting to in the world, is a certain understanding, even if vague, that they've been deselected for. And they get violent as a result, because as I've said, identity is about violence. And when people lose their identity and they're fighting for their survival, they generally don't give up easily or go easily, right? They don't just disappear, they fight back. So that's exactly what Europe had been cultivating for centuries and for millennia. Not just that the Christian, even the Christian master morality cultivated slavery and resentment, right? That they go hand in hand. So this was the most fatal form of insanity that has ever yet existed on earth. When these little lying abortions of bigotry begin laying claim to the words God, last judgment, truth, more so wisdom, Holy Spirit, and thereby distinguishing themselves from the rest of the world, when such men begin to revalue values to suit themselves, right, flipping the world on its head, changing the values and the meanings of things, as though they were the sense, the salt, the standard, and the measure of all things, then all that one should do is this: build lunatic asylums for their incarceration. To persecute them was an egregious act of antique folly. This was taking them too seriously. It was making them serious, right? It was making them mad. The whole fatality was made possible by the fact that similar form of megalomania was already existent, right? Gets into his criticism of the Jewish form of religion, right? And says the whole part of his notion that why you prepare for insanity is because the Christians, the extroverted, sensuous Christian, world where that religion was suitable to take root, um, lacks the general introvertive and intuitive tendencies of the Jewish culture. So when Nietzsche says most Christians aren't Jew enough to handle the guilt, it's a physiological statement. He's saying these are different types of people who had different belief systems, and the adoption of one and the subversion of power by way of morality has been a curse on the strongest instincts in the will to life and art and new discovery since for our and whole history. You would say that in theory the history that we have and how it's told is told from the Christian perspective. Even if you make it secular, it still focuses on these sort of humanistic values that come directly from Christianity and nowhere else. It wasn't already rooted in these sorts of belief systems that go back to, again, why Nietzsche chose, Zarathustra as his name, and why, it was for many reasons, but part of it was because it was the act of instantiating evil as the permanent principle. It's kind of Gnostic, right? Because man becomes an inferior being who has no place here. He's an alien in his own universe, when in reality he's part and parcel to this larger selection and deselection process. Where is anything separate here, right? Where's the beginning? Where's the end? Nobody actually knows, but the middle is everywhere, right? So going on, because I've read that before, he's kind of talking about Hellenistic syncretism, because he questions, did Plato get his idealism from the Jews in Egypt, perhaps, right? And what we're talking about is at the end of the Hellenistic era, there was this creative explosion of, cultures colliding, cultures collapsing, and it brought about that no different than the Magdalene period of cultures and peoples colliding and exploding in a worldwide burgeoning of consciousness that made itself manifest in art all over the globe. Similarly, where civilization and tribes had rooted all over Europe and the Middle East, these things were coming into fruition. And so, let's see, he's talking about, all this stuff is emerging in the chaos. I have a bunch of notes here talking about the end and the decline of American empire, Christianity's proverbial downslide from here on out, what the world has seen, especially is made possible through TV, then internet, is a worldwide sort of aesthetic, scientific, and religious modern syncretism. Everyone is seeking every last road. Every plant seeks to grow and develop itself. All inventors are seeking to invent. Philosophers and artists seek to create. What Nietzsche observed and credited to Western empire was Christianity's ability in the evolution of the individual to create new and unique forms of humanitary, solitary inner genius, which no other culture, linguistic, or belief system could or did create, even with the conflicts of ideas and idealisms passing through that aren't original or organic to the initial cultures, such as Nietzsche mentioning Plato bringing in outside contamination, like from Egypt. This is also part of why Nietzsche wrote that Europe's best genius is her ability to transmute her suffering, right? Because what he says is that there's no suffering the species knows that the individual doesn't, right? So he makes that clear, especially for the thinking individual who actually looks at the suffering of life. Don't fool yourself and think that everyone thinks deeply about life, that everyone cares about life. No, a lot of people just care about their paycheck. A lot of people just care about sensual fun. A lot of people don't care about anything at all. So, the kind of universalism that Christianity and that Western idealistic utopian thinking lends itself towards is this brain dead idealism that finds no root in reality ever. So, going on to number 203, these small virtues of gregarious animals do not by any means lead to eternal life. To put them on the stage in such a way and to use them for one's own purpose is perhaps very smart, but to him who keeps his eyes open, even here it remains, in spite of all, the most ludicrous performance. A man by no means deserves privileges, either on earth or in heaven, because he happens to have attained to perfection in the art of behaving like a good-natured little sheep. At best, he only remains a deer, absurd little ram with horns, provided, of course, he does not burst with vanity or excite indignation by assuming the airs of a supreme judge. What a terrible glow of false coloring here floods the meanest virtues as though they were the reflection of divine qualities. He's basically saying the most common temperaments and attitudes and the idea that being good means being weak, means fitting in out of fear, that he's saying there's nothing special about this. The natural purpose and utility of every virtue is systematically hushed up. It can only be valuable in the light of a divine command or model. Meaning, again, I said it before, everyone does as they're told. Everyone does as they're paid. If you know who butters your bread, you shut up, you take the payout, you do the crimes, you do the time, right? It's just how it goes in the world. Or in the light of the good which belongs to a beyond or a spiritual world. This is magnificent, as if it were a question of the salvation of the soul, but as a means of making things bearable here as with many beautiful sentiments as possible. He's saying it's an aesthetic phenomenon. That's how they were trying to make existence bearable. All these beautiful and highfalutin thoughts that just don't, that don't root in reality. This is 342. A consistent type understands that even evil must not be hated, must not be resisted, and that it is not allowable to make war against oneself, that it does not suffice merely to accept the pain which such behavior brings in its train, that one lives entirely in positive feelings, that one takes the side of one's opponents in words and deeds. By means of a superfoetation of peaceful, kindly, conciliatory, helpful, and loving states, one impoverishes the soil of the other states. That one is in need of unremitting practice. What is achieved thereby? The Buddhistic type, or the perfect cow. This point of view is possibly only where no moral fanaticism, right? It's basically saying, he criticizes Stoicism as those who swallow glass and scorpions, meaning no matter what happens in the world, they're going to grow more gracious or more angry, but it's always towards that more humble, more gracious, right? He's saying you're just becoming more and more like a cow who chews up everything. This point of view is possible only where no moral fanaticism prevails, right? Moderation. That is to say, when evil is not hated on its own account, but because it opens the road to conditions which are painful. Unrest, work, care, complications, dependence, right? Like he says in Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nobody wants to rule, nobody wants to lead. Both are too bothersome, right? Give us our word, give us our play, but so long as it's not too much of a bother, so long as you don't ask us to take it seriously, so long as you don't expect any real loyalty or anything human from us. So, this is the Buddhistic point of view. There is no hatred of sin. The concept of sin, in fact, is entirely lacking. The inconsistent type. War is waged against evil. There is a belief that war waged for goodness' sake does not involve the same moral results or affect character in the same way as the war generally does, and owing to which tendencies it is detested as evil. As a matter of fact, a war of this sort carried on against evil is much more profoundly pernicious than any sort of personal hostility, and generally it is the person which reassumes, at least in fancy, the position of opponent, the devil, evil spirits, etc. The attitude of hostile observation and spying in regard to everything which may be bad in us, or hail from a bad source, culminates in a most tormented and most anxious state of mind. Thus, miracles, rewards, ecstasy, and transcendental solutions of the earth riddle now become desirable. Like I said, escapism, anywhere but here, those sorts of thinkings. The Christian type, or the perfect bigot. C, the Stoic type. So he's saying there's three types here. The Buddhistic type, the Christian type, and the Stoical type. The Christian type is a perfect bigot, right? Because they refuse everything outside of them. It's a slavish morality that, doesn't understand anything. So the Stoical type, firmness, self-control, imperturbability, peace in the form of the rigidity of a will-long, profound quiet, the defensive state, the fortress, the mistrust of war, firmness of principles, the unity of knowledge and will, great self-respect, the type of the anchorite, the perfect blockhead. Right? So he's saying, okay, yeah, go on ahead, be your perfect statuesque self. It doesn't mean anything. It's not a virtue in and of itself. It's just a way to self-negation, self-abnegation. It's another fabled way out, another channeling of the emotions, right? You can sit on the ground and meditate, shut up and do your duty, right? But none of these are real answers. None of these are things we haven't already seen before. So if someone posits it as an answer to today, they're just copying someone else's ideas. Chances are they don't even understand them. As Nietzsche said before, the best proponents of most any intellectual or philosopher or artist are those who don't understand them. Excuse me. 343. And now we have 343. An ideal which is striving to prevail or to assert itself endeavors to further its purpose, A, by laying claim to a spurious origin, by assuming a relationship between itself and the powerful ideals already existing, right, either for or against, going to steal or steal back. C, by means of the thrill produced by mystery, as though an unquestionable power were manifesting itself. D, by the slander of its opponent's ideals, right, by attacking your enemies, by lying teaching of the advantage which follow in a wake, for instance, happiness, spiritual peace, right? Come join the cult, come give us your money, and you can attain this or that. That's what he's kind of talking about, those kind of attitudes. Or even the assistance of a mighty God, etc. Contributions to the psychology of the idealists. Carlyle, Schiller, Michelet. Supposing all the means of defense and protection, by means which an ideal survives, are discovered, is it thereby refuted? He's saying basically, if you uncover the shell game of conscience that someone plays in their morality of being the weaker bargaining position, does that mean their cunning has any less effect? Well, he goes on, it has merely availed itself of the means by which everything lives and grows. They are all immoral. Right, he's saying they're appropriating the master's tools in their own warped understanding. It's a twisted mirror and reflection is what it is. And then Nietzsche goes on, my view, all the forces and instincts which are the source of life are lying beneath the ban of morality. Morality is the life-denying instinct. Morality must be annihilated if life is to be emancipated. Now that's pretty serious. He's talking about being beyond good and evil. And emancipated is a strong word, and it carries a lot of connotation and baggage, both in general history, but especially in English-speaking Western American history. Words like emancipation, liberty, freedom, these are all arguably the most misunderstood and misguided concepts on the planet. But this isn't even a good translation, because I looked at the original German, and he doesn't say my view. He says, what is it? My insight, right? View is a different word. Insight is a different word in German. So he says, my insight. All the forces and drives that give life and growth are under the ban of morality. Morality is an instinct under the spell of morality, right? That shell game. Morality is an instinct of the negation of life. You have to destroy morality to free life. And there's a more I think, accurate to his original conception in his writing, his meaning, not just a one-to-one translation or a poetic translation. Right, my view, all the forces and instincts which are the source of life are lying beneath the ban of morality. He's saying that the strong are given poison to drink, right? That the strong, the curious, those who would seek to overcome their limitations by the superstitions of the herd, by the misunderstanding and appropriation of values by the mediocre, by the average masses of man, right? That the superior types get buried. So when he comes up with a term like free spirit, this is what he means. That your thinking, your being, your use of linguistics, your own personal inner world is no longer tainted by the shame and the original sin of this superstitious religion that got a hold on, so many people's minds. And from here, he gets into, I actually went on ahead and jumped ahead to him talking about the will to power is relevant in science, because as he discusses in Zarathustra, the very development of science very much was motivated by fear. But I don't want to get lost in those details just yet. So Nietzsche very much is a proponent of the freedom of the human spirit. It's just the thing is, in most people's heads, they have no grounds upon which to accept the full implications of what he means, because they are so caught up in what is a historic and past tense worldview, whether that's Christianity, general English terms, common language, right? They haven't done the internal development. They haven't read the thousands of years of history. They haven't spent the tens of thousands of hours reading, writing, exploring, because at the end of the day, these things are expressions of one experience. It's not like people read books and just learn how to think. The only reason why a thinker learns how to think is because they find truth or some aspect of reality and humanity and how they even behave there around and therein, within this entire process, and that man has always been a part of this process, but the whole basically the whole mass production of mankind and then as subsumed to a state has reduced all of mankind to a general mythology that just doesn't truck in Nietzsche's worldview, in the sense that, again, he sees it that we are different types of people. Introverts and extroverts are different types. More so, even then, just because someone is a certain way doesn't mean they wind up a profound thinker or being, because very often they're poisoned by their beliefs. They're poisoned by Christianity. They're poisoned by the social people around them who say, no, don't go too far, we got to drag you back. So I had a few more thoughts here to share, a few more, and lastly, there's a few quotations here to share. Now, I know I mentioned that Will to Power contains some of Nietzsche's heaviest hitting critiques of Christianity. Obviously, there's the Antichrist and Beyond Good and Evil, which attacks not just Christianity, but also so much of the underlying metaphysics and what he would call errors and assumptions. But he uses certain people as examples. So to lay the framework, I have a quote from Pascal here where he writes, "We cannot think of Plato and Aristotle save in professional robes. They were honest men like others, laughing with their friends, and when they amused themselves with writing the laws of politics, they did it as a pastime. That part of their life was the least philosophic and the least serious. The most philosophic was to live simply and quietly. If they wrote on politics, it was as though they were laying down rules for a madhouse." Because remember, Plato was a playwright. He was a poet himself. "And if they made as though they were speaking of a great matter, it was because they knew that the madmen to whom they spoke fancied themselves kings and emperors. They entered into the views in order to make their folly as little harmful as possible." So Pascal's asserting that Plato was selecting and deselecting in man, but only that the majority of them are so stupid they need the noble lie, which leads the most powerful to interpret Plato as the original Machiavelli, and then Plato is taught to the masses as if he was anti-Machiavellian. Anyway, Nietzsche goes on to give you a counterpoint to Pascal's general condition. Nietzsche says, "We should not deck out and embellish Christianity. It has waged a war to the death against the higher type of man. It has put all the deepest instincts of this type under its ban. It has developed its concept of evil, of the evil one himself, out of these instincts. The strong man is the typical reprobate, right? He's a criminal, the outcast among men. Christianity has taken the part of all the weak, the low, the botched. It has made an ideal out of antagonism to all the self-preservative instincts of sound life. It has corrupted even the faculties of those natures that are intellectually most vigorous, by representing the highest intellectual values as sinful, as misleading, as full of temptation," right? That's not genius. You're experiencing genius. That's the devil, right? You must be a witch. The most lamentable example, the corruption of Pascal, who believed that his intellect had been destroyed by original sin, whereas it was actually destroyed by Christianity. So Nietzsche is asserting that Pascal could never overcome his own internal senses of guilt and shame in relation to these mythologies, because that sickness had a grip on him. Like I said, Christianity poisons higher and different types. So here is one more. Oh, well, we already read that. "When the average and mediocre type become the measure of all things, then all that one should do is this: build lunatic asylums for their incarceration." And, look, I know it's easy to get alarmed at these sort of talks and this sort of language, but just take it simply for what he's saying. He's saying that the smallest people on earth who are subject to the most external powers lose their minds under the pressures thereof. That mentally, emotionally, physically, they cannot handle the demands and sophistication of an ever-changing, ever-complex world. They thought they could keep the world in stasis forever. They thought they could have it their way forever. They thought they could put humanity to the sword forever, and that they wouldn't be resented, and that people wouldn't have grudges and rise up against them in resentment or otherwise, right? It is a fatal form of insanity. And so, ignoring like any kind of judgment therein, he's just saying these people are psychologically unwell. my own case study of Americans as a very Christian nation seems to indicate that this is true, right? The amount of homeless and insane and homelessly insane, arguably by the time you're homeless, that sort of alienation and dehumanization creates further insanity or becomes its own form of insanity, right? People talking to themselves because they don't have anyone else. Um, but, Pascal also points out, men are of necessity so mad that to not be mad were a madness in another form. And that's Pascal. And again, think of the radical, the firebrand, the incendiary, the anarchist, right? Their whole province is madness, and they want others to be mad too. Rousseau is an example of this. And I guess here's the difference: is Nietzsche is a spiritual anarchist, and spiritual as a symbol for what lives and resides in the body, right? It's not, there's no substrate, it's not metaphysical, it's just here, embedded in time and eternally recurring in our propagation of personality types and what we select and deselect for therein. Um, but basically, what he says of the firebrand, because he recognizes himself as one, he says of guys like Rousseau who do incite to anarchy and violence of the plebeian kind, right? Just caveman nature, right? Returning to that state versus no, we go forward. We like novelty, we like creativity, we like intelligence, right? We don't want to, like, those who don't have to don't want to go play the stupid games that the people had 2000s of years ago. They move on with their lives, right? They don't keep doing the same things over and over again once they realize the limits or mistakes therein, right? So we're talking about getting over the past, getting over oneself and one's own sense of being mired there, right? That's the kind of free spirit Nietzsche is speaking of. So Rousseau isn't a free spirit because he's angry, he's mad, he's insane. But Nietzsche points out he sees the depths of that call and the depths of that heart. And what he asserts is that that same disease side of man that urges destruction and decay and demoralization and the weakness of life, that on the flip side from this disease skin, it comes from the deepest, ultimately, that desire, that urge, that impulse, it comes from the deepest golden heart. And that golden heart of the earth is laughter, that one could take in so much suffering and not become insane thereby, that one would not call for caveman, like for return to a caveman state of being, to go to recede further into Christian man and the Western world's general anti-intellectuality, the general dehumanization and devaluation of man by turning mankind into cattle and regulating them through institutional controls wherein the individual actually has no authority and no genius that isn't already laid claim by the state. And what Nietzsche says is that's the superfluous, that's the Christian, that's the botched and the bungled. Now, that doesn't change the nature of things. The power is hegemony, and nations are all about maintaining power, fighting anyone who dares, fighting and destabilizing anyone who would encroach on that power. I guess amongst scholars, it's kind of called, Thucydides' trap. There's this idea that as nations try to overtake each other, civil wars and ways about doing this competition are argued over, but it's all a sign of the times and of the decline. So anyway, for all the kind of talk around Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, you can search all of YouTube and you'll see most people are talking on the most shallow of levels. Most people are talking about the most basic elements because it's what's most common and it's what's most understood. If you actually read Will to Power, if you read his whole literary body, and even including Thus Spake Zarathustra, what you'll see is that he has built a solid case against Christianity as a simple error of history. Like, if humanity were to survive 10,000 years in the future, they would just see it as a mistake. They would see it as a wrong turn, no different than, hey, you made a 2,000-mile journey in a car or in a plane and you realize you didn't turn where you were supposed to. No big deal. But to the people in the meantime who've come to identify for, they have the physiology for the bodily training through a society that called for and selected them towards being this gregarious moral animal, then things start to break down. Then unreality and weakness and morbidity begin to overtake strength and beauty, right? The resentment of the compassionate and the pitiable begins to tear down and destroy all culture, which again, as I said, culture is the very standard of beauty, strength, and that is representative and emblematic of laws that are barrier to individuals, so that people seem confused that nations deselect for people, either the other people or their own people, that people seem confused as to how that happens. Well, that's just what history has been. And contrary to this whole, this last century where people were fighting for permanence and stasis amongst constant flux, is again, it doesn't stop here, and the future will be unrelenting. So these mythologies, these delusions, they'll continue to get washed away. People will continue to lose their minds. It's just what the world, in its many errors and mistakes, has called for, has selected and deselected for. Whether it understood the effects and the affects or not is another matter. But the point is an interim step in history. It simply worked for a time. And like any other methodology, you realize once it runs out of its carrying capacity, then new things, novelty is born. And that's evolution. And that's the real evolution of man and the liberation of life therein. So again, Nietzsche, the spiritual anarchist, Nietzsche, the antichrist, Nietzsche, the man who states all of nature is a will to power, and a man is a part of that. So I hope you've enjoyed this analysis. I hope this finds you well wherever you're at, your future, my past. It's getting pretty dark here. Sorry, I hope it's not too hard to see if you're watching, but I figured the lesson itself is what's more important than the appearance here for the moment in the dark. So again, take care of yourself. I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for checking out the channel, and I'll see you then. Take care.